Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Philippine Geographical Society Lecture Series 2021. This program is organized by the Philippine Geographical Society in partnership with the UP Department of Geography. I am Oni Martinez and I will be the moderator for tonight. If this is the first time for you to join our lecture series this year, well, just a brief rundown for you. The past 11 sessions of the lecture series covered a variety of topics from community resilience, participatory mapping of safe spaces for the LGBT, participatory 3D mapping for disaster risk reduction, imagined future geographies of migrant families, spatial politics of port management, mining hazardscapes, cultural memory for disaster risk reduction, food security in the Philippines, everyday hazards, bird ecology and conservation, and insights on community mapping and open data advocacy. We are sincerely grateful to all of our speakers in the past lectures and to our awesome audience and viewers who have supported us all the way through tonight's session. Tonight is going to be nothing less than special, as the 12th of the lecture series highlights geospatial ethnography and the production of geographic knowledge through current technologies and spatial tools. Before we proceed, let me just go over our house rules for tonight's program. During the presentation, attendees will be on mute, but we encourage you to interact by typing your comments and questions in the chat box. Questions will be addressed during the open forum. This lecture is being simultaneously streamed in the UP Department of Geography YouTube channel, and also please note that this meeting is being recorded and will be made available for viewing after the event. And just to give you a heads up, we will be taking a group photo before we end the meeting, so please be ready to turn on your camera later for that part of the program. To begin our session, I would like to call Professor Garcia, the President of the Philippine Geographical Society, to give the opening remarks.
Thank you, Oni. Magandang gabi po sa ating lahat. Welcome once again to another episode of the Philippine Geographical Society Lecture Series 2021. On behalf of the Philippine Geographical Society and the UP Department of Geography, I am happy to welcome everyone in this evening's lecture. Amidst the pandemic, PGS and the UP Department of Geography has found a way to share geographic engagements that are being done by fellow geographers and allies in the field. This is the 12th lecture in the series. We started in January of this year, having a minimum of one presentation per month, and we are proud to say that the lineup of presentation go as far as the first quarter of next year. Much like a year-long conference, wouldn't you agree? For tonight, we are fortunate to have the map maker himself share his experiences, both as a geospatial worker and scholar, collaborating with various groups and stakeholders on humanitarian projects, urban design and planning initiatives, and the crowdsourcing communities of practice. As is our tradition, we did a word cloud of the keywords of your registration submission. For this lecture, the word cloud is dominated by the words culture, community, interesting, GIS, spatial, space, intriguing, and a number of other keywords that altogether build up to what we hope could be covered in tonight's discussion. On this note, I again would like to thank everyone for joining us tonight, and as always, I hope we have a very special and productive session. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Garcia. I'm quite intrigued with the inclusion of intriguing as a word, as part of the word cloud, and perhaps our speaker can also comment on the word cloud later, and let's see what his insights are in relation to our viewers' impressions about our topic for tonight. Our presenter is an alumnus and a former faculty member of our department. He obtained his master's degree in geospatial analysis at University College London, and his PhD research is underway at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand. He is a volunteer and voting member of the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, or HOT, and the founder of the Ministry of Mapping, a Philippine-based collective of mappers and mapping practitioners advocating for open data and care for geospatial workers. His professional practice is enriched by years of experience working with various communities and sectors in the Philippines and overseas on humanitarian projects, urban design for sustainable development and resilience, volunteer and crowdsource mapping initiatives, among other stuff that contribute to supporting open data and collaborative geographic knowledge co-production. And so with much anticipation for this talk tonight, friends, let's all welcome Mr. David Jonathan Garcia.
Okay, sharing screen. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes po.
Salamat. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to my home department in the Philippines for this privilege and opportunity and chance to do what I call a home run. After so many years of going away, I can finally present what I found out, especially to the department and also the PGS, and especially to my mentors who invited me here. In particular, si Ma'am Oni and Sir Eman. They were my fieldwork instructors in particular, where I had a really good taste of what to, how to make a map out there and not just in the laboratory. And also my other geography teachers here and also former students and classmates. It's nice to present to our own folks. All right. Um, ako po si David Garcia at ako po ay Kapampangan at Tagalog din. And I identify with both peoples in the Philippines. I speak now from Aotearoa in the South Island. The Maori name is Tewai Ponamu, and it is from this place and the spaces of refuge offered to me by our Austronesian relations that I was able to finish this work, or almost. And I would just like to recognize that space too that they are holding for me. We peoples of the Philippines are very related, actually more than what we were taught about the Pacific cultures. Malapit talaga tayo sa kanila to the point that we speak the same words, and I'll speak more about that later. And then thirdly, in this about this introduction, I welcome you, everyone who was here, and everyone who made time to listen to what I've got to share for about 30 minutes, and then for maybe the next half hour, we could have a good discussion. I'm framing this as a mainly academic talk because it's the PGS and the department who invited me. And at this point, you will notice I will break like the curtain. You will see the same slides, but this time I will give you some of the behind the scenes how I did the mapping and the research at the same time. All right, so doing geospatial ethnography. In this cover, you will see a painting by Johan Vermeer. It used to be one of my favorite paintings in the world. The title is The Geographer from 1669. It was started in 1668. And it is a classic painting that's used by different geographers when they try to express themselves in social media. So I've seen this other map makers share this painting. And if you would notice my caption on top, I intentionally put that there because this study is about studying the mapmaker and the discourse and the culture and the stories we tell ourselves about how we are doing the mapping. Right. It is also, this talk is very methodological and it's full of dilemmas, and you might come out of the talk with more questions, which is my purpose, and which I suppose is one of the key benefits of doing an ethnography. By describing the ordinary and making the strange familiar and the familiar strange, we might be able to generate questions that we were not able to generate before due to our previous commitments to, let's say, the quantitative disciplines. This is part of a bigger project, which is the PhD. And I cannot present the whole PhD, but I can present more of the methodological part. The whole work is called How to Make a Map Maker, and I'm finishing this right now. I have a full draft and I am revising, and hopefully I can also benefit from your feedback as I try to wrap this up. All right. The spirit of this presentation is like this. You will feel this kind of energy, and for folks who are curious about this approach, I place my work within the longer anti and decolonial struggles, especially in Asia and the Pacific, That's why I put this here, and I have another story about this later. So at this point, I am foregrounding my politics. We need to demolish the empires and demolish colonialism. That is, I put this up front and center. Anyway, mapping is a political exercise, and I'm honest myself about that. Another caveat is that there are some um, triggering content for folks. So I'm going to talk about disasters and crises. And now we're in a global pandemic. So I hope you understand that I need to present it, but I will just go through them very quickly. And also another crisis called colonialism, which is ongoing. I hope we can navigate this space together. But if ever at one point you feel overwhelmed by the discussion, please feel free to pause and just mute me. That's totally understandable. At the end, I will try to come back and end with a hopeful conclusion. Okay, so to cut the long story short, these are my key findings and key propositions for this methodological and partly theoretical presentation. That we need to remember that mapping is labor, and that mapping is about making meaning. It's not just about making accurate representations or consuming information or communication. It is about the creation of meaning through which humanity travels. And finally, which is also a dilemma for many workers of geographical information, we need to maintain this view that mapping is not neutral. It can be both decolonizing and recolonizing, and given the state of the world, there's really a strong tendency that it tilts towards the latter. Sometimes even when we do our personal best, and that's why we need to work collectively. Finally, in this long introduction, so three main parts. I'm gonna give the foundation of what the geospatial ethnography is really about, and then I'm gonna give some examples of the ethnographic tales that I had to weave and negotiate and co-create, and finally some ways, not even ways forward, but just ways of moving with these ideas and feelings. Uh, in plain words, for folks who might not be academics but are interested in the approach, my advice is that when we do geospatial ethnography, which the bottom line is studying the culture of the geospatial, the makers of contemporary geographical knowledge, first is we try to flip the gaze. Instead of studying, let's say, tribes, native peoples, indigenous peoples, we study the specialists, we study the experts, and we study the analysts, etc. We study their organizations. So that's one. Flip the gaze. Number two, try to resist and refuse and rest when you can, because this process is um, very emotionally, spiritually, mentally taxing. Because as we flip the gaze, we are ourselves are also challenged about our assumptions about how geographical knowledge is produced, and in many ways how the world works. And finally, I do this all of these things in flipping the gaze and resisting and refusing and resting, because my desire is to help recreate our who we are as maritime culture, and also many other things that we are trying to remember as peoples of the Philippines, Austronesian peoples of this ocean, that by flipping the gaze, recognizing the structures we live in the creation of geographical knowledge, as we resist, refuse, and rest, we open spaces for our ancestors to walk with us backwards to the future. Right. As some of us know, this is my usual spiel. I made a career out of making maps, whether in planning or in mapping, or in humanitarian work or urban design, and I still do make them every now and then, especially because I need to earn extra income. I'm still a grad student, and right now my pivot is making maps of the region of the Pacific, because I am in the Pacific. And even though one of my aunties think that New Zealand is in Europe, which is not entirely wrong, it's a colony. We are in the Pacific, and I commit right now. I'm committing more of my work to centering worldviews and interests of our relations here in the Pacific and the ocean too. So these are some of my work. Folks always also joke about this, that I look like the guy at the center, but I really identify more with our ocean peoples And this is also another personal journey. One of my desires in doing this journey is to try to piece together certain linguistic elements of who we are and just spend more time building good relations with our ocean relatives, especially here in this side of the Pacific where I'm from. My work background is this work with the UN in a team, and we used to do crisis mapping and urban planning. And I put this here because these experiences, which are very personally important and had personal consequences even for my mental health, one effect is that they enabled me to question my previous value systems. I grew up in a very evangelical upbringing with Christian cosmologies in my head since I was young. But because of these crises, I started also questioning the things I really believed in and the books that I wrote and basically books that I read. And basically, I noticed a big difference between what is taught by the books, say in mapping, and what actually happens out there when you face the people and live the life of a map maker in crisis. Another inspiration I take in this journey is that we need to remember where we come from. And this saying, ang di marunong lumingon sa pinanggalingan ay hindi makarating sa paroroonan, really helped me through this process. And that's why I said earlier during the pre-talk chat that most of the things that I'm doing here is not really new. So for the folks who are looking for something flashy, innovative, like data analysis, this is not the place. But I hope what you get here is a more slow and nuanced kind of reflections in terms of why we do what you do, and then you take away what you can when you do the quantitative analysis again. Okay, part one. Let's go straight to the methodology. The context is we live in a world that's continually making crises, whether it's framed as urbanization or land use change or the spread of cyberspace, the reproduction of virtual geography, or the social inequalities that we see in terms of precarity. And because of that, crisis is used for as a trigger, as a provocation, um, and as a prompt to make do-doomer maps. If you notice, whenever a problem is presented about climate change, ecological crises, gender issues, mapping is there. Okay, let's make maps. And I place my work within that movement, and we expect mapping to make a difference today. Although I need to do it more critically, especially in participatory mapping. Because of that, different societies try to um, shift the locus, or in plain words, the way that we make maps. Before so the story goes, there's a royal bureau, the ordnance survey, NAMRIA, the central mapping agency. They're supposed to make the maps, the official maps. And uh, for you to conduct business or avoid lawsuits, you have to follow that map, the truth defined by the nation state and empire and their formations. But as the decades progress, so the story goes, this production has become democratized, and this is true more or less to a certain extent. And I also put my work within this context that folks expect the production of geographical knowledge to become decentralized, distributed, and hybrid. And it has a bit of a positive tone to it. It's very attractive. We're opening the world. We're freeing geographical information, and it's also a desire that you could actually connect to certain open knowledge movements like Wikipedia, which apparently was inspired by a book by Karl Popper, who wrote the book The Open Society and Its Enemies. And Karl Popper wrote it here in Christchurch, where I'm at the moment during World War II. So it was the product of that time as a response to nationalisms. And this is what I tend to follow since I chose a humanitarian path. Within that decentralization trend is what we call crowdsourcing. And here, the boundaries between the producer and the consumer of the information are supposed to disappear. In other words, they're the same person, the same group, the same institution. It's not just the map maker from the environmental bureau who's supposed to make maps anymore. Everyone is supposed to make maps in this trend. And here you have buzzwords like participatory mapping, citizen science, VGI, etc., etc. And again, my work helps describe this phenomenon. right? That's why I chose OpenStreetMap as a topic, because OpenStreetMap, for example, when you open your phone on Facebook, the map that you see there, the data is a lot of it is from OpenStreetMap and many other apps that we use today. And it is still continuing, it is still growing, it is a free and open map of the world. It is a map, it is a community, and it is a project. And I think we have folks here from OpenStreetMap Philippines, hello, and other OpenStreetMap communities who are still participating in this still very exciting project, started in London by Steve Coase in 2004, and with millions of contributors. This is an interesting field for me, academically and even personally. And this is how it looks like for folks who haven't seen the main page of OpenStreetMap. Folks, so the story goes, call this the Wikipedia of maps. I'm not gonna do this. There's no time in editing. I'm gonna skip to some of the things I heard when I started um, observing what happens in OpenStreetMap. So first thing, I noticed that there's a lot of excitement in the movement. For example, you hear folks saying we need to map everything everywhere, and we need to map all the things. Happy mapping. We are on the road to everywhere. And for me, this is part of the social life of the map makers, this kind of excitement and also hype and also encouragement that fellow map makers say to each other. So I heard this. The more that I hear this, the more that um, I realized, okay, there are scholars who already talked about this, like Chrisman, who said that mapping is both social and technical by nature, and GIS is not just a software, but it's actually an organized social activity. And also feminist GIS scholars like Pablo Skaya also tell us that uh, when we study maps and spatial and geographic knowledge, we need to study not just the maps, but the bodies who make the maps. Because that's how we can trace, let's say, the biases, the cultures, the values that get translated into the map and the effects in the real world. Uh, Pavlovskaya, Mariana Pavlovskaya and their collaborators call this the mapping subject. And because of that, I honed in. So crowdsourcing, virtual geography, we need to save the world, and then OpenStreetMap, and then GIS is social and technical, and then okay, which aspect, which in particular social aspect, and also technical can I focus on? It's labor, and I chose this because I'm already a map maker, and that's already my career, and I just wanted to have first a unique contribution. It's not necessarily new, like a new world, a new land, which is very colonial. I just wanted to at first really highlight what's usually ignored, especially the people who make the maps, and not just the executives, but the actual people doing the editing, doing the translation, doing the interpretation, the negotiation, etc. For folks who are into GI science literature, you notice that there are certain traditions that are related to labor but need to be understood from the perspective of labor. First is the mapping is knowing tradition, which is about representation. Next is mapping as consuming, which is also related to communication. And also cognition. There's a cognitive and psychological tradition in the study of maps, and mapping as an instrument of power. That's why I put this icon here, Game of Zones. This is for the critical GIS folks. And I appreciate all these traditions, but this time I said I'm going to suspend that as an academic and also a practitioner. They might be useful, but this time I'm going to focus on the lived experience, which for me is a very interesting field of study. I think about it, and from our experience as OpenStreetMap volunteers and supporters, crowdsourcing is not just sourcing, it's working and collaboration. And there are many kinds of work. There are OpenStreetMap volunteers here who um, who may agree that OpenStreetMap is not just about the map. OpenStreetMap is not just about the map. OpenStreetMap is about people. And when we say people, we have cultures and value systems and different views on what is the true map and the geographical truth. And all of this mix and match and is contested and is debated and is translated on the map that you see on your Facebook app. which is usually deemed as objective, etc. But it's not really straightforward. Um, so basically, what I'm trying to say here is labor is important because without labor, there will be we need labor to produce geographical knowledge. It is always part of the process. OpenStreetMap is not just about tracing. Therefore, and this is, I think this was in 2018 when I was developing the project with my relations, I thought, okay, to understand GIS, I need to follow and continue to become the map maker. This is the methodology that I will choose. So I started going back to my social science training. I had to step back from my geospatial analysis training in the UK and go back to where I really came from, the College of Social Science and Philosophy, and check works on anthropology, for example. And ethnography really interested me because my training in the Department of Geography in UP is about participatory mapping and locating our work within a social context. And I thought, well, I think we've been doing this somehow in our own way through participatory mapping and local community mapping. How about I take it to another direction and describe the mapping process using hopefully anthropological lens? Because ethnography is can lay bare the messy and fertile terrains of human experience. This is by Dr. John Ong, critical media scholar, who's also Filipino, is now in the US. And I still find what the anthropologist Mead said, that there's a difference between what people say, what people do, and what people say they do. And one of the ethnographer's jobs is to compare and describe that and hopefully learn something from that. Another scholar that I would like to really thank is Sindilin, Dr. Sindilin, who did a similar study in Indonesia. What Dr. Sindilin did was to, as part of their bigger work on the precarious nature of digital labor, especially in environmental management, etc., was to study Indonesian mapmakers who were working as contractors for the Indonesian government, who wanted one map for their whole archipelago. And Dr. Lin followed them when they did the survey, when they went to the office, when the tracing, and I said, this is very interesting because they were able to understand and also critique the production of geospatial knowledge from the everyday lives of the map makers, from the details, and I'm really interested in those details. Therefore, in a geospatial ethnography, when we do it, we intertwine, and not only that, we problematize um, these binaries, which we try to overcome to space and society, geography, anthropology, cartography and ethnography, visuals and narratives. If you really think about it, every map is part of a storytelling or a discourse. And every discourse, when we spread a kind of discourse, let's say CNN, when CNN presents news about its other or its enemy countries, it also gives a map. Like, this is the map of the world. These are the the enemy countries: Iraq, North Korea, Afghanistan, etc., Venezuela, and these are always intertwined stories and maps. And I said, okay, I won't take this for granted. I'm gonna make a problem out of it. So I had to go back. What is the relationship of storytelling and visual making, charting, cartography, and ethnography? Before, hundreds, so the story goes, when the empires and the wannabe empires wanted to colonize the world in their panic and the race to extract as many resources and labor and bodies and knowledge as they can. You used to have this central office with this kind of cartographer, the geographer, who's like the geographer in The Little Prince, sits in the office, and then they send out their explorers and cartographers. Sometimes they go to the expeditions and then they write about the people. They make all the assumptions about the people they want to colonize, like Pigafetta, who was a rich Italian nobleman who went with Magallanes and Elcano during their colonial expedition. They also took an enslaved Austronesian named Enrique, but that's for later. And then in that process, what the anthropologists and cartographers do in that time was they put the monsters on the maps, and the farther you are from Europe, the more monsters you get. Three-headed people, ugly people, um, monsters that destroy ships, which is nice sometimes. And this is how Europe, the societies in what we call Europe today, tried to imagine the world and imagine themselves in relation to the world. That we are the enlightened, civilized place, and this is this dark universe out there in the cosmos, waiting to be discovered and put into order and discipline. And if we really go back, for example, in our story as Filipinos in the colonization of the Philippines by the U.S. Empire, this was also done. The combination of making maps and also doing anthropology, like in this work by Daniel Brinton. If you read, if you read the text, that kind of exoticism is there. So again, I'm saying this because I'm trying to problematize this kind of method. Doing cartography and ethnography is problematic in itself, and for folks who want to do this is something that it's hard to run away from. You really have to face it. Why am I doing this? What for? Etc. So at the time, this was 1898. That was also the time when the revolution against Spain was happening, and the American and Spanish empires were making a deal to buy the Philippines through the Título Pari, uh, where our ancestors were not present at the negotiating table to buy the Philippines and its peoples for $20 million. It's really hard to disconnect geographical and anthropological work, especially at that time, from motives of empire and capital. And then as the decades proceeded, the relationship of geography and anthropology um, continued, possibly deepened. This person that I put in the in here in the slide, his name is Robert McNamara, and this was the time of the U.S. invasion of Vietnam. And I'm also very interested in this because as a Kapampangan, the U.S. Empire used our home province as a staging point for that invasion of Vietnam during the Cold War. So at that time, the Americans and their intelligence officers would send their specialists out, their anthropologists, military analysts. And at the time, they were also developing an early form of the geographical information systems. For example, through institutions like Harvard or those in California, where the military industrial complex is very strong. And at that time, they will merge the anthropological observations of the military specialists with the early forms of digital mapping because they wanted to optimize the bombing, especially let's say places in Laos and the backdoors that the revolutionary forces were doing. So that was really a very hurtful point. And when I thought about this, let me check the history of this project, or Robert McNamara. Robert McNamara was a Ford CEO, and then he became the U.S. Secretary of Defense during the U.S. Invasion of Vietnam, and then later he became the president of the World Bank, which for me, all right, this is like different heads of empire. And World Bank and other institutions fund crisis mapping groups like Hot OSM and many other groups. And for me, I want to trace and I have discussion where the ideas from the Cold War translated to current crisis mapping practices like those produced. And I'm a member of HOT. I'm a voting member. I commit to the human rights cause. But for me, my personal stake is we don't want to repeat those mistakes from the past. And how does that happen? There's a noticeable change in this story that I said. So before, as the story goes, you have a European geographer assuming things about the world. Sometimes they credit the local collaborator, but really it's really about this, and the book's about the white man. And then it became like this. Okay, they go out some more. They really delve into the population and stop assuming too much, but while still assuming too much while colonizing the world. It continued to be a tool of empire. But now I notice a shift in the mapping subject, and this is where the labor and body and feminist perspective, and also possibly socialist perspective comes in. That um, today's crowdsourcing depends on the creation of the mapping subject and the support of the mapping subject, especially the precarious uh, citizen who wants to help the country, also address their own economic precarity, people like me who want a career, and also do something good out of it and be connected to an international network. So for me, these are very important points as I tried to problematize geospatial ethnography. At this point, I had the dilemma while developing the method. I said, I'm gonna study myself and my career, and this will have implications in my employability too. But looking back at the history of colonialism in the Philippines, I said, I think it's just the right time to contribute to revealing this system from within in the best way that I can. It's an ethical, possibly a moral impetus for me why I did it. Um, so I formulated this. I said, well, if in the past these methods have been done, especially ethnography, to study my ancestors, why don't we use the same method to flip the gaze and then study the people who are so obsessed in studying us? I was also operating on a gut feel. You will feel it in your gut to that. Okay, something is going on. I might not be able to articulate it yet because of the language, the colonial language and discourse I received. But the more I try to unpack this and confront myself and be accountable to the people around me, hopefully the more I can reveal the system and we can do something about it and hopefully mitigate or not reproduce the mistakes of the past. Right. Um, I think I already said this. Which specific methods that I use? So broadly, it's about patchwork ethnography, which means you get data from different sources, from social media, from reports, from from talk in a conference, from emails, those that I could cite. Speak of emails, digital, social media played a big part in this, in my participation, and I had to tell all of my relations that I am doing this as an academic, as part of the study, and people could tell me if they want to step away and not be mentioned in this study. And finally, and this is how I really drilled into, I thought about the ethics of the study. If I'm going to study the cultures around me, I better make sure that I address my own positionality and reflect on my own journey why I'm doing this. Hence the I drilled down to autoethnography and the title How to Make a Map Maker. What are the main themes of doing this work? First, weaving the field site, which means I had to network a lot and meet a lot of folks, and then help locate specific map makers and mapping groups and talk to them, and hopefully create stories and experiences with them. And I explain to them, I share it almost immediately right away through social media, and then I get feedback about it, and then we negotiate the ethics of the conversation. This is the long list of the research practices: joining Slack, organizing events, applying for scholarships, actually making maps, giving talks, being there, traveling, which really took a lot of time and resources, uh, to different social groups. I had to focus on Asia and the Pacific because I identify with the region anyway, and also just broaden my reach because you see, before I was focused mainly on OpenStreetMap, but later I had to expand it to the open source community in general, especially open source geospatial. And this is part of my data, the stickers I collected, and this is how I tried to relate with folks and participate. And this is really part of the cultures of cartographers. You give out stickers as rewards, and it keeps the mapping going. These are the places that I went to, and I think the folks who really helped me finance and be able to participate in these workshops. And this is the social media part. I'm going to skip now to because of time interest, so we can focus on the discussion part. I'm gonna skip this part, and I'm just gonna mention that I joined many groups and created many pages. And at one point, I became the central the center of the network in terms of diversity and people I talk to on Twitter about OSM. Okay, so I'm gonna focus on these findings. Uh, what are the cultures of cartographers in OpenStreetMap? First is that we want the map to be free and open, which is also a contested thing. I'll unpack that later. Folks also contribute to OpenStreetMap to have fun for recreation And the practical uses for navigation, let's say Strava. Folks want to make their cycling experiences pleasant and good. Another culture that I notice is that the you need to attribute OpenStreetMap volunteers when you use the data. And I think that's fair enough because it's labor, mostly free labor. And also consultation, whether in the starting of projects, creation of different kinds of tags for the map, and just in general asking for help, attribution, and consultation. Next is maintenance and repair. I met map makers who've been doing this for years with their free time, unpaid, unrecognized, and we really appreciate them. And they really care about the work, which is something that's honorable and respectable. Maintenance and repair. Another culture in OpenStreetMap is equity and justice. So you have groups like GeoChicas and MapBex and Mental Health Awareness and the Queer Map by Kikube and many more who are trying to diversify and also challenge the misogyny and racism and sexism and other oppressive ideologies within the mapping community, which is really related to diversity and inclusion. For us to remember these cultures of cartographers of the free and open mapping community, uh, I made this acronym frame. How is OpenStreetMap framed? And this is something for us to hopefully remember and reflect on. Right. Okay. These are the examples of the groups that I told about, especially Youth Mappers, one of the largest networks of map makers in the world. They're amazing. Um, Also, Grab, which also sponsored hackathons, and Mapillary. It's a corporation who specializes in street level imagery, supports OpenStreetMap 2, Mapbox, etc., etc. I'm gonna skip this now. All right, before that, you should try this website. It's very interesting. It's called OpenG Fiction. It's based on OpenStreetMap, and you can make your own world. Right. Okay. Moving on to more findings. When we try to understand OpenStreetMap, we need to suspend our stereotypes about who a mapper is, because one mapper can be a member of many communities and a member of multiple groups. And the volunteers are volunteering not just for mapping, but for many motivations. It's for work for some. For folks, it's to have someone to talk to. There's intimacy in terms of friendships in OpenStreetMap, and folks who met the loves of their lives in the community, which is great. And also, um, I see OSM as kind of a club of clubs. It's an intersection of many interest groups. So when we say OpenStreetMap community, it's not a monolith of just one kind of mapper. There are many interests involved. That's why I think that's something that I appreciate. There are opportunities to challenge, let's say, a dominant kind of map making, but those challenges are also that kind of challenging can be limited, as I will show in my final story. Okay, I'm gonna skip this now. Skip these. These are just my sketches while I try to do the PhD and start with. Right. Okay, so I'll end this. So we're two-thirds done now. Sorry for spend so much time. Maybe 10 more minutes. And I just want to tell you three quick stories that are really important, which might be your takeaway when you do this. I start with this. I think it's important that we remember that it's not just the maps or the mapping method that matters. Who makes the map matters, and who tells the stories about the mapping matters too. For the most of the world's history, the stories about the mapping have been written by Western authors, usually men, straight men. And that is a problem because they come from a certain tradition and a culture, and it does not explain everything. I remember, let's say, in the old ages, when the explorers came, they had to hire local guides. But those local guides are not usually recognized, and they usually do most of the work. And today too, I still notice it when I go to the bookstores and then I see travel books. It's still the same people like James Cook and some big colonial explorers still being glorified. I said, I don't know. I'm interested in the bigger sense of the truth. So we need to tell our own stories. And there are three stories I'd like to tell you right now. Okay. The first is about geospatialism. I have noticed that whenever I open my emails, I see this particular image about how the world should work. Geospatialism is a discourse that centers the network and digital technologies in the production of geographical knowledge. I understood this more when I reflected on my particular experiences doing fieldwork. I used to take flights a lot during my humanitarian life when we were doing fieldwork, and I remembered whenever I looked out of the window, um, and I looked at the rice fields, my hands would twitch, and I would like to digitize what I see outside the plane. It's like a body urge to do it. And then I looked at the kinds of marketing materials being put out, let's say by magazines like Geospatial World and other geospatial marketing websites. The main message is something like if you don't transition to digital, your discipline will die. And I think this is very unfortunate too. One of the consequences of the geospatialist movement is that it can marginalize many kinds of knowing, pluriversal ways of knowing about the world. In plain words, it's this: digital mapping is not the only mapping available to humanity. As Jim Enote says, was part of the Zuni Nation in Turtle Island in the US. There are maps in songs and maps in ceramics and maps in prayers and maps in stories. And many of these geographical knowledge are not necessarily in a shapefile or in a satellite imagery. And because institutions today are being structured, let's say, to throw away even the physical maps and just go all digital, create you have this new field today called spatial data science, which is recycled GI science and geomatics. It's very unfortunate that this discourse is centered even careers. So if you, let's say, if you focus on even what I do as a trainee in ethnography, uh, it is unlikely that you'll get opportunities here because the inherent motive is to collect as much data as possible about the world. And this is something that we should be critical of, that we are committing to this digitalization of the world. But in that digitalization, are we making sure that we respect indigenous knowledges and other forms of marginalized knowledge? And also, are we telling the public uh, an accurate, not really accurate, a more honest account of what we really do? The next account I will tell you, aside from geospatialism, oops, I'm gonna go back to this, is this. Okay, my second story out of three. At one point, when remember I said I was traveling around the world, we were organizing hackathons. Particularly, let's say there's a cyclone that's gonna hit an island in the Pacific, and we need to create maps, let's say through missing maps or hot or other crisis mapping projects. So in a room, you have people with volunteer hands and expertise, and they have their laptops. And at one point, no, at multiple points, when I was reflecting on the experience, I heard this similar phrase. So, for example, I'm digitizing an island in the Pacific. We need to help save this place, etc. That kind of talk. And then the participant would say, when they're looking at the island, oh, there's nothing there. There's nothing there. And I heard that in many places, in London, in Germany, in Wellington, even from myself, that when we look, let's say, at an island in the Pacific, um, that phrase, oh, there's nothing there, it's spoken. And looking back, we have this concept called terra nullius, which is a very colonial story, that whenever a mapping was being done by a dominant group, they will render first the place as a blank slate, ready for the borders to be drawn and for the imperial cosmology to be imposed over the place. And I had to talk with my colleagues about this even publicly, because we noticed, oops, something in the chat. Okay, because we noticed even within the crisis mapping community that this is really inherent in the practice. I'm not gonna delve into the details now because I think folks are trying to wrap that issue up. But there was a time when there was a documentary produced about mapping the Philippines, and the same discourse was said, like saving saving the Philippines, they're monsters in the maps, and then three white men come in, they try to save the Philippines with crisis maps, and we had to call them out on this, and then they took the video down. um, what I'm trying to say is, even though we think we are in a new age of maps, colonial habits die hard, especially in international aid arrangements. And this is something that we need to continue to talk about, because if we really think about it, colonialism is very anti-human rights. It's a life-destroying force, and it marginalizes and dispossesses peoples. And unfortunately, I see it in the humanitarian movements today. So I keep asking myself this question: is neo-geography, like crowdsourcing, that's the term, is neo-geography neo-colonialism? And one of the points that I had dilemmas about is this particular point. For example, when we map a place using OpenStreetMap or any other open mapping projects, do the people there have an opportunity to refuse? And to address that, what I notice is folks consult with the locals there. So what I appreciate, let's say, with groups like OpenStreetMap Philippines, is folks do their best to contact someone from there, and sometimes also that's being done at the global level, someone to contact at the national level, but that's not enough. Groups, let's say, at the national level are also trying to contact the locals, because I think there are, and feel there are certain knowledges that should stay hidden and sacred, and it is up to the indigenous group and their expression, their articulation of sovereignty, what they want, to determine whether they want to share that or not. So that's my second story. And then my final story, skip, is about this one, this image. So when I came to New Zealand and I tried to face these dilemmas um, about the inherent colonialism in contemporary mapmaking, I had to go back at my motivations. Why am I really doing this? Because my motivation is to really help my peoples. And this particular journey is something that is unfolding, that I was not able to fully address in the PhD. It's beyond the PhD. And it's about our shared ocean heritage and cultures. When I came here to Aotearoa, to New Zealand, I heard the same words. In Kapampangan, we have a word for an elder, which is matwa. I went to a conference in Wellington in one of my fieldwork, and I heard the same word from our Maori relations. They said, "Oh, matwa, matwa." And I said, "Are you saying matwa? What do you mean?" "Oh, it's for an older person." And I said, "We say that too." And apparently, we have so many words in common. Matwa, mata, banwa, it's fenwa here. Lima is rima, papa is papag. And if you follow my social media feed, I put that out every now and then. And this really motivated me to continue map making. And over the past months and even hopefully years, I was trying to change my relations. I was trying to help connect with folks here in the Pacific, because I think I shouldn't quit map making, because I belong to wayfinding culture too, which is from the Austronesians. I'm gonna show you the map from the process, and this is where I'm gonna end. When my relations changed, as I was doing my study, my maps changed. So, for example, this is one of my latest work, March early this year, acquired by the Auckland Museum. It's about the Pacific seafloor. And in this map, I flipped the world upside down and centered the Pacific, and it just gave me a different perspective of the world. That's New Zealand there, that's the Philippines, and you can really see that we have seas of islands. The Pacific is not an empty place. The story "there is nothing there" it's completely false. Another map that I've been making, this one is an ongoing project for the University of Guam. It has a similar um, um, theme or model. I flip the world upside down. It's not the London is the center of the world. I centered the Pacific and just emphasize the ocean. And I've been trying to understand these journeys, aside from actually learning waka wayfinding with a group called Tetoki Voyaging Trust, where we go out to the ocean and look at the stars. And that is where I would like to end. Um, about recreation. One of the things I believe and know why we continue to make maps is because there's an inherent joy in it. Um, I've been reflecting on the journeys of our Austronesian ancestors. Tinatanong ko din yung sarili ko. Sabi ko, why did they go all the way to the rest of the Pacific? Is it just for food or to have territory, etc.? And I reflect on my experiences out there when I was doing field work, and also out there in the ocean. There was a night when I saw a sky full of stars, and the galaxies were very clear with the other folks. I felt joy, and for me, that is something that even though I was not able to fully explore within the ethics and means of my project, is something that I would like to continue. In fact, what OpenStreetMap say in the emails, in the tweets, and other communication is this happy mapping. And that's how I want to end this presentation. Thank you so much. That is all.
Thank you so much, David, for your very insightful presentation. And we're looking forward to the questions of our audience. Please use our chat box here in Zoom, and you can also interact with us using our Facebook live stream and also the YouTube of the Department of Geography. I think we're ready to accept questions now, and the open forum is now gonna start. And so I'd like to read the questions from the chat box, and I believe, David, you can also see these questions. I'll start with a question from Dr. Vanessa Joy Anacta. The question is, humans differ in their perception of the environment. How do you deal with such differences and vague information humans provide when you design maps?
Maybe this is a tangential answer, but maybe it will help give an answer. Hi, Ma'am Joy. Thank you. That is true. We differ in our perception of the environment, and there are differences. In particular, in OpenStreetMap, it is done through consultation, especially in the, let's say, mailing lists. For example, I give a particular example. I had to tag a particular occupation with the permission of the occupiers, because they're reclaiming the land, getting the land and ocean back against the colonizers, colonial police and developers. So I put it there. But then there's another volunteer, and I put it as a camp. But OpenStreetMap classifies camp as recreation, and what I'm trying to map is an occupation, which is also a camp. But there's no tag for it. So I asked the other volunteer who is a long time volunteer of OpenStreetMap here in New Zealand. There's something wrong with the classification, and this is the typical problem with a lot of the categories and the tags in OpenStreetMap in particular, that because it came from London, in the University of London in particular, and extended by Western practitioners, they put their conceptions about the world there, and there's a bit of there's a lot of contestation there in dealing with differences. And one thing I'd like to say about that is, folks like me and folks who care about more plural conceptions about how the world should be represented, we bear the labor, which I hope is not the case. We bear the labor of really at least calling that out, so folks, older volunteers are unsettled. I have another example. I was in a conference in Wellington, and someone was mapping roads and measuring the typical GIS study of measuring the accuracy and completeness and all that. And then I pried into their methodology and asked, well, have you considered that there are many places, let's say in the maritime cultures of Southeast Asia, the villages have boardwalks, which are where people walk. That's the street. But in OpenStreetMap at that time, I think it was 2019, it was classified as a bridge, which is for me it's a very Eurocentric term. So we do it through contestation and these discussions, and unfortunately, it doesn't change a lot. Another way that I've been trying to at least think about these dilemmas, about the differences in the ways of making, is there was a time when I just stopped mapping. I said, if my desire is to support indigenous sovereignty, the mapping could help. Let's say if you change the place names, but there are actual movements beyond mapping who are taking their indigenous spaces back. And there were points that I had to stop writing and mapping and just went, because I said this is my bigger mission. And hopefully out of those relationships of sovereign indigenous peoples, they will choose whether to share, how to share, what kind of method, who to map, who's the map maker, etc. I recognize there are folks, say here in Aotearoa, who use closed systems, and this really riles up several European cartographers, because they want to, let's save the world, open the world, liberate all the data. And what folks are telling them, well, that's an assumption that people want to share and should share the data. So it also boils down to the level of sovereignty. There are native groups who choose to use open source too, but what they do is they make it offline, for example. So that's another way how I try to understand and at least collaborate right now. Not the Westphalian kind of sovereignty, like this is your place, my place. More nuanced view of, not kind of parang Tagalog nationalism, not like that.
Thank you for your answer, David. There are a few more questions here. I think we can still accommodate two. And one is coming from Gwen Vasquez. Thanks for the awesome presentation, Sir David. Gwen is from the Ateneo de Davao. I found it interesting when you said geospatial ethnography intertwines and problematizes binaries like geography and anthropology. Some anthropologists argue that geographical concepts like space and place have posed problems for anthropology because they tend to confine natives to an ethnographic locale. Can you or
Mm.
have you encountered some tensions like this?
Yes, even for myself. At one point, because there are colonial categories about who we are. Example, ako ba'y Asian or Pacific? Or that binary. Ano ba ako? Kapampangan o Tagalog? Yung ganyan. And I just had to say, I don't want to answer those questions anymore. And I relate more with the ocean in general, while also respecting differences. What really helped me in the process is to try to reimagine or question my conceptions about space and time. I go back to the Kapampangan language. When we say the word banwa, it means the sky and it means the year and the time. So banwa can also mean a measure of age. For example, how many years? Pilang banwa. There are other Austronesian languages, when they say banwa or something linguistically, phonetically close, it means the land, and other folks, it means the people or the village, like Magbanwa, that surname. Someone told me, and you can please confirm this, I haven't validated this yet, but apparently sa Batanes, Banwa is that space on the reef where you put your boat as like a safe dock. And for me, I think that's a useful, based on my positionality where I come from, I want to embrace that non-binary view of space and time, and it's really about this spiraling in and spiraling out view of space, knowledge, and identity and reality that I think is inherent in oceanic cultures. That's what the wayfinders say. When they go out there, it's not like there's a 2D map and then you go through around the map. What they're doing is they are pulling islands out of the sea and pulling the world towards them. And if you really think about it, let's say when you see the stick charts by, let's say, our Marshallese relations in what is called by the colonizers, Micronesia, they have this map of their seas of islands where the islands are connected by waves and swells. And today, if you compare that with the talk about spatial data science, network analysis, etc., network analysis, etc., I tell my colleagues that's our wayfinding ancestors have cracked that philosophically before, even with their bodies and their actual experience and expertise, that they've seen space as a network long before Doreen Massey and Yifutuan and the other post-structural geographers uh, conceptualized it from the Western perspectives. They were just catching up. So my answer there is I try to loosen my commitments to the human geography canon. It's really I just go back to our stories back in my hometown, and that really helped of remembering where it come from. About Banwa, if you're curious about that idea, if think about the seas of the country Vanuatu, or here in Aotearoa, Banwa means Fenwa. In other seas of islands, they say Fonua, Honua, and it's really this intersection of the spirals about space, time, and identity. And I just like centering that at the core of the practice, and that's something that geography and topology could really learn from instead of slicing peoples and places all the time.
All right, David, I have around 3 questions left for you to answer. I hope we do have the
I
time.
have I have
Yeah.
time. It's okay.
Okay. So the
I'd love
third
to answer.
question or comment from Hannah Hipe. She's asking what books about wayfinding space and time from us Pacific Islanders POV. Thank you. And she said, I agree with how lacking and questionable some travel guides are
Mm-mm.
that are written. Okay, so this is more like a comment, and maybe you briefly want
Yep.
to address
Mm.
that.
Thank you. This is also a recent experience for me because I just recently transferred to the Macmillan Brown Center for Pacific Studies. So even for me, I'm in a journey of learning more about our relations. So before I tell you the book, let me just say uh, there's the term Pacific Islanders also contested, and folks use it, not use it. Apparently, it's also a U.S. term based on their statistical, racial, ethnic categories. But given that there are work that I really find very useful in how I understand folks here. For example, works by Dr. Teresa Teaiwa, that's one. By Dr. I'm gonna try put it here. Teaiwa and Tracy Banivanwamar. What I like about the work of Dr. Tracy Banivanwamar, and this is also related to the previous question, her book is Decolonization in the Pacific. And one of Dr. Banivanwamar's, she's already passed away, arguments is that the peoples of this ocean have been cosmopolitan all along. And there's this misconception that we're confined in small islands and then the outsiders come discover us. Actually, folks have been going around all along. And then recently, genetic research has just been catching up about that. And I just like that conception that we are both global and local at the same time. And I use that idea to challenge my humanitarian colleagues because they have this talk that there's this international mapper, international volunteer, and the local mappers. And I've been telling them, come on, we're both. We can do both. There should not be a binary between the both. And we need to unsettle that because they also use that as a labor to organize labor. Like you have local mappers and then international highly paid ones come in. Another one is by Dr. soon to be Dr. Maddie Williams, who's here at Canterbury. I'm gonna get the book very quickly. This book it just came out recently. Polynesia. There's no digital yet, but I hope they publish uh, soon online. I'm also trying to return to the work by folks in CSSP. I need to read more about Antro and what folks have been doing, things that I missed. And one thing that we shared the same desire when I look back at my education, and I wrote this in the dissertation, I said, how come I missed all of this important knowledge? I went to UP, and then I went to London, and I went to here, only to realize that what I've been looking for was already there. And I was not just paying attention to it. And supposedly the whole educational system is to fault in it. How come that we have geographers who go through the systems, even internationally? I went to the department that pioneered GIS, but this important truth about our wayfinding culture is not even mentioned. At the start of the GIS lecture is Jon Snow and other white men, and tell myself I need to spend more effort. This is just what I want to say, that let's all do this to try to get to know our relations in the Pacific once more, because we are part of a bigger family.
Okay. Another comment here on an official map of the country. This is from Cecilia Joey. After that, we'll have the two last questions. David,
So,
thank you.
Yung right. All right,
Official
but I'm
map.
just wondering if um I I I I prefer not to answer the question, but because Namria, that's Namria's job. They want to do it. On the other hand, that's got to be critiqued and always contested. That's what I prefer to study some more. Like, how do countries call their map official? How they construct an official map? How does the officialness of a map get practiced? Let's say, because in my experience, when we go to an LGU, people who would like the official map, and then we go outside, pupunta kami sa labas, and my field instructors know this. Will try to find the locations of the monuments, go to the forest, all because the officials do not want litigation, for example, and they need to follow their papers. And I want us to unpack that further, because I think, given the kind of nationalism we have in the Philippines, many of what we call official maps today, for example, even maps about IPRA and also ancestral domain, the process is very contested and very controversial. And when we say, I suppose what I'm trying to say is, let's try to look at maps not from the eyes of the state, but from the eyes of the people who live in the place. That is why I try to not answer, is there an official map, because my interest is to unsettle that.
Thank you, David. We're taking two more questions. This one is from Professor Maylin de Guzman. Thank you so much for an insightful presentation. I particularly appreciate your reiteration that mapmaking is value-laden and informed by our many sensibilities and intersections of our multiple axes of identities. The question is, how can we navigate the impetus of cartography to locate and visibilize populations and reconcile it with the desire of some targeted populations to remain invisible in their safety and security? How can we make sense of these geonarratives given the many tools available for map makers? After that, we'll address the question from Karima Bacas. Thanks, David.
Ay, si Karima. All right. Thank you, Muhammad. This is always the dilemma. The example that I skipped, I'll just focus on that story about mapping, free and open mapping, especially, let's say, human rights violations, which is very hot and very contested and risky for map makers too. So at one point, I came to a dilemma doing participatory mapping when the government changed, because I thought, well, if these maps are out there open and anyone can use them, anyone with the internet access can use them, this can be used to harm people. And in fact, there was a time in my career when I went to a police station office, and then I saw one of my maps printed in tarpaulin. It was very huge. And that was the time of the Tokhang. And I thought to myself, the story that we tell ourselves as open mappers is these maps are supposed to help people. There was one point when we put out a collaboration with Rappler. Ako, si Patricia Evangelista, si Carlo Gabuco. I was making the map nung araw ng mga patay. Nagtatago ako sa timog. Nagawa namin, saan yung tukhang, etc. And then we put it out on Facebook. And then the responses were interesting because our intention was to show folks the argument that the war on drugs is a war on the poor. And but the responses were different. Ang sabi nung iba, totoo yan. Diyan naman kasi talaga yung mga nagsasabu at yung mga ano ng lipunan. So that really helped me rethink why I do this and the consequences of the work. And this is something that me and my relations still try to navigate. I'm very thankful that I'm accountable to my fellow map pickers, so they tell me if I'm doing something wrong, or I ask them for result for advice if something is safe or not. At the end of the day, I think it, and this is something that folks in the Ministry of Mapping have tried to cultivate, that the community is the most important, uh, in our work, and then the map makers, and then the maps. We say this because there's been this tradition in the mapping community that everything you do, it's all for the map, even if you get tired and etc. So we try to translate this in our practice by sometimes, actually many times, even refusing to map. And that's by definite answer. It's about refusal. Especially now we have recolonizing systems. And this is even part of I have current tensions with certain members of OpenStreetMap community, because sometimes I just refuse to participate in something that I think it's not correct, or that will just endanger my relations. This is also from the feminists in particular, the concept of refusal and also complaint, by Sarah Ahmed, for example. And I would just like to thank them for helping me learn more about this. This will not address the bigger risks, let's say that human rights activists have been facing, but I hope it could be a useful one. My last my I suppose I go back to my experiences in crisis mapping too, about prioritizing the community. Two experiences. One was in Marawi. There was a time when we had to stop certain or pause because the mapping process was hurting our collaborators. Like the act of mapping the place triggers memories, triggers experiences that are really unpleasant and hard to handle. And sometimes we just have to listen, and sometimes, um, actually many times, we need to refuse to map certain things. And this is something that the disciples of the enlightenment will not understand, that there are sacred knowledge that we need, and relationships that are more important than the mapping. Number two is from last year. Remember, last year we did so much crisis mapping, even early this year, and the folks who are related to Ministry of Mapping and the volunteer communities have been mapping food pantries, etc. But what I noticed is we tried to rest some more, and we just say no if the project is too much, when it endangers our welfare. So refusal.
Thanks, David. And the last question from Karima. I would like to comment on your note to recognize the research assistants and field guides we need from the low C or low key of our studies. I feel that knowledge production is in the academy is still a bit exclusive in reflecting on the position of the researcher, and in the large scheme of knowledge production and liberation, perhaps gradually we shift this practice to a more engaging one, and with proper recognition of the locality and the persons involved in the larger research process. Would you like to comment on that?
Mm. Yep, true. I had a similar question and comment the other day, and also suggestions. I did a similar presentation last Monday to Pacifica colleagues here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and one of them told me a very nice reminder. He said, David, maybe you need to address your saviorism, which you got from the humanitarian practice, and you go save the world, save less. And I said, yes, that is very important. That we don't disempower or um, respect the sovereign choices of communities and their relations. I also recognize that while academe has an important role in society, let's say articulating issues, doing some form of resistance to oppression, it is still well within those systems. So there are really limits to that. Uh, in our particular context, for example, in a colony like New Zealand or Australia, settler colonies like the United States, Canada, French Polynesia, etc. Um, I've noticed that um, I'm going to talk about decolonization in particular as a particular liberation movement. There are, it is common to see today academics writing decol in a settler colonial context without even mentioning land back. And for me, that's one of the deep related issues. So nagsusulat sila ng decolonization pero ayaw nilang isauli yung lupa. Ang sabi ng isang colleague sa Australia, siguro kung gusto natin i-decolonize yung academia dito sa Australia, ibalik natin yung ninakaw na lupa kung saan nakatayo yung yung universidad. Natawa kami ng tawa pero tama kasi if that's the desire, uh, it's possible that in the process of inclusion, incorporation of indigenous knowledge, it's just another form of assimilation to the current structures. And what folks are saying is give us the land back. Of course, it's a different situation in the Philippines, but maybe we could learn something from this. Uh, my reflection, for example, in my practice as humanitarian mapmaker is in Tacloban. So folks, when I was doing my stint there as an urban planner, folks have been saying, you need to give us land, you need to give us space, do not dispossess us. But the humanitarian system was so focused on maintaining good relations with that government before, with the liberal government. But people were already in the rallies, people surged the joblessness and the waterlessness in the resettlement sites. And the humanitarian system was just mostly uh, looking away. What am I trying to say? Um, if you really try to help, and this is something that I had to change tack and really change my. I had to question why am I really doing this? Uh, there are many times that many things that I did not record in the PhD, but I did it in support of the decolonization movements. I really determined one for example about decol. There are folks who want the ocean back here in New Zealand, and I'm trying to write a decolonial PhD. At least I'm trying. But I told my relations, hey, there's a protest over there, and we're here writing in our office about it, and they're telling us, no, we need you here, like on the street. So I dropped my writing. I was almost close to the conclusion. I said, screw this. I'm gonna join my family there. And for me, that was an important turning point, which was also an outcome of that critical reflection in the PhD. That my work is just one part of a bigger movement, and I need to be accountable to that movement.
All right. Thank you to everyone who participated in the open forum. Thank you for your questions. We understand that not all of the questions were addressed. David, how do they get in touch with you if you're open to discussions after this?
Sa email, please don't message me through social media anymore. I can't answer it. But I answer to emails now. Also, let's keep in touch. If it's social media, let's share about food. I'm trying to make my cyberspace more positive. If you have recipes, I have a new hashtag meal maker, and then we can we can exchange there. For academic stuff, email please. mapmakerdavid@gmail.com.
Thanks, David. And we'll also forward your questions to David. Yeah, David's email is posted in our chat box. Please, you can message him and
Yep.
perhaps continue the discussion and keep it rolling after the event.
Yep.
So thank you again.
Oni,
yeah,
I just want to say one last thing, which is the usual thing
sure,
in
yes.
forums, which is to thank the Department of Geography and my mentors there who launched me into this process of seeking knowledge. Yung katulad ng sinabi ko kanina, yung hinahanap ko, nasa harap ko lang. Yung halimbawa, knowledge tungkol sa mga Austronesiano, nandun sa college. Ikot pa ako ng mundo bago ko na-realize, ay, nandito lang pala. Alam na natin. So I really want to thank all of you for training me in participatory and critical methods, political ecology, pagiging ang pakikisama sa tao at ang lahat ng natutunan ko sa inyo. Salamat po.
Maraming salamat, David. Nakakataba ng puso, no? Na makita yung, saksihan din mismo yung practice mo through the years, no? Starting from the department and moving on to so many other things to help different communities in the Philippines and also overseas. So at this point, while after David has thanked us, we also want to show appreciation to our speaker tonight. And the PGS would like to give the certificate to our speaker for sharing his valuable insights and expertise. And I'd like to read the certificate of appreciation that is given to David Garcia for sharing his valuable insights and expertise as virtual resource speaker for the talk, Doing Spatial Ethnography as part of the Philippine Geographical Society Lecture Series 2021 held on October 20, 2021. This is signed by Dr. Joseph Palis, the chair of the Department of Geography, and Professor Eman Garcia, President of the Philippine Geographical Society. So again, David, alam naming busy ka, maraming ginagawa at marami ding kailangan balansehin.
Nagluluto.
Maraming kailangan balansehin mga bagay, no, sa schedule. Pero thank you for the opportunity to discuss with you and be able to talk to you again through this event. So thank you again, David. Thank you so much. And so at this point, I think we just have a few announcements before we close the program. There's an upcoming talk, on the reflections on the policy shift from widespread to targeted curbs in the metropolis amid the COVID-19 pandemic. This is a talk by Timothy Jane Cipriano. Si Tim was also a grad student of our department. This will be held on October 29 at 5 p.m. Next slide, please. And we are still open for membership. Okay, so anyone who would like to submit their forms for membership, you simply have to check the website of PGS that's already written here sa slide, and also the Facebook and other social media pages of the organization. Lastly, we hope that you folks enjoyed this talk as much as we did, and so please answer the feedback form so that we'd be able to, assess how our participants and audience are receiving our event, our lecture series so far. If you want to check out the previous lecture series, the previous episodes, please do so. You just simply have to go to YouTube and search for the channel of the UP Department of Geography, and you'll find all of the previous talks and webinars, and the lecture series in that channel. And please also join the International Conference on Geographical Studies. This will be next month. It's just 2 weeks na lang yata. This will be on November 4 and 5. This is all online. You can also look at the announcements sa Facebook page ng Department of Geography, and also the website of the Philippine Geographical Society for the details of the conference. Please also watch out for updates from our social media links. And so before we end this event, we would like to request our